help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. LaKisha Simmons. Dr. Simmons will look through the life and times of Harriet Jacobs to explore Black women's experiences in slavery, anti-slavery activism, and the importance of source materials such as slave narratives. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn, you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may not have heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. LaKisha Simmons, a professor of history and women's and gender study at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the lives, writing, and histories of Black children and families in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is an award-winning teacher for her work in the classroom, including the distinguished Arthur F. Thurnau Professorship Award, an award earned through the nomination by students and peers for teaching excellence. She encourages students to look at primary source material and engage in project-based learning. Welcome, Dr. Simmons.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you all today, and I'm excited to share the life and story of Harriet Jacobs. I think we have a poll for you all to fill out. Hopefully we can try to run that. And the poll is really just asking a question about how many people are teaching Frederick Douglass's slave narrative or pieces of it. And how many people are already teaching pieces of Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative, incidents in the life of a slave girl, or pieces of it. One of the reasons why I'm asking is because quite a few people teach at least about the life of Frederick Douglass, and some people teach snippets of his slave narrative or the whole thing. But so far, I have not encountered very many students who've started reading Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative in classrooms. And yet at the same time, in history, in women's history, and in African-American studies, Harriet Jacobs has become really popular. And so a lot of people are teaching her. Many of us are writing about her life. I'm currently writing a book about Black families in the transition from slavery to freedom, and I'm writing about Harriet Jacobs's daughter, Louisa Jacobs. And a lot of my friends and colleagues are also writing about Harriet Jacobs. So I see this text as one that's going to become really popular in the upcoming years, and I imagine like movies and many things. So it's a wonderful text to teach. And I'm just kind of looking at some of the poll results here, and I see that quite a few of you are teaching Harriet Jacobs, at least a few of you are, and I hope that this webinar series will give you more insight into her life and times and some of the primary sources that also go along with her narrative. And more of you are teaching Frederick Douglass than Harriet Jacobs. All right. So I want to say a little bit about the goal of the 3 webinars that I'm doing. Firstly, it's to introduce you to Harriet Jacobs, her autobiography, and her activism. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is an excellent slave narrative to read and to teach. It has become increasingly popular, as I mentioned. Students love it, and in my experience, actually read it, which is always good because they don't always get drawn into the text that we try to get them to read. And it's also easy to break up. It's called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl because the chapters are really just scenes, and so you don't have to teach the whole thing. The 3 webinars also use Jacobs related primary source material, as well as other primary sources written by women, both anti-slavery activists and sources about Black women in slavery, to draw out the wider world of the 19th century. So we'll be talking about Black women and girls in slavery and women's anti-slavery activism. And I've got two screens, so if I'm looking to the side a little bit, that's why. So this is just a broad outline of the 3 webinars and where this one fits in. The first lecture is called Written by Herself, The Making of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And it's going to be the background story about how incidents in the life of a slave girl got written and how it's remembered and its place in our national memory, but also within history and thinking archive or art in terms of archives. Lecture 2 will be about Black women and girls in slavery and freedom, using some of the stories from Jacob's narrative and some of her primary source material, but primary sources also about other Black women and girls. And then the third lecture will be Women's Activism, focusing specifically on this group of anti-slavery activists and women's rights activists, a kind of interracial group of women who were doing this work before the Civil War, during it, and after. So that's lecture 3. And it kind of follows Jacobs and her group of friends in those years after incidents is over. Okay. So as I mentioned today, we'll be talking about the history, the story behind the story of incidents in the life of a slave girl. And I've titled it Written by Herself. You can see that the subtitle of the slave narrative on this page that you can see here is the first page of the narrative. And above this, it says Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then here you have the subtitle Written by Herself. I guess I could also mention the very first copy of Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. The cover said Linda, which is her pseudonym that she wrote under, Linda Brent. So the cover said Linda. So one of the subtitles was Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and then another subtitle was Written by Herself. But the Linda has since been dropped. Okay, so today's outline, part 1 will be talking about slave narratives a little bit more generally, but thinking especially about how writers establish truth in their slave narratives. Part 2 will be gender, remembering, and forgetting, focusing especially on how incidents in the life of a slave girl got forgotten. And part 3 is about authorship and confidence. How did Harriet Jacobs come to write this text? And how did she feel about being a writer? And then the conclusion will be talking a little bit about genre, what I think makes incidents so special. And I'll give some recommended readings, and hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions. All right, part 1, establishing truth in slave narratives. As many of you know, slave narratives as a genre are really unique. They responded to 18th and 19th century reading publics. In particular, they were thinking about, writers of slave narratives were thinking about white audiences who would be reading their text. And they're speaking directly to these white audiences. Their readers were people who were already sympathetic to abolition or ones who were willing to be persuaded. And so that's really where this writing tradition comes from, but also the very specific goals of the writers of slave narratives. Therefore, writers tried to produce an emotional response in their readers to the story that they were telling. And so emotion and sentiment is incredibly important pieces of the stories that they're telling. And so is, I think, this relationship between audience and writer, right? That the writer is always already thinking about their audience. Another really important point about slave narratives that maybe isn't always obvious to our students is that the writers themselves were part of a cosmopolitan, multiracial culture. So, although many of them started out as enslaved people, sometimes in rural areas of the country, by the time they're actually writing their narratives and selling them to the public, they would have traveled north. Many of them traveled to England. They were on speaking circuits where they were talking about the dangers of slavery. They were meeting with other abolitionists who had traveled the country or the world. And so their vision is incredibly broad, right? They're not just formerly enslaved people from some rural areas, but they're also these really cosmopolitan, worldly people. And so that's something that just maybe our students don't necessarily think about when they're thinking about the authors of slave narratives, but this is universally true of slave narrators, of these narrators, at least of this particular genre. So, quite a few folks have, sorry, I'm just closing this poll. I'm sure quite a few of you have seen and thought about the sort of beginnings of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which is the autobiography by Frederick Douglass. And in the very first pages of the text, Frederick Douglass takes pains to explain why his story is important, how it's true, and why he's a trustworthy narrator. And this is really important to thinking about slave narratives, but it's important in their circulation. The writers often try to prove that they were who they said they were and that they were doing this truthful work. And so you can see this in narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. On the very first page, there is a subtitle that says written by himself. There's also in the first pages a sketch of the author, so you can see what he looks like. There's a preface by a famous white abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. And there's a letter from Wendell Phillips to also attest to Douglass's intellect, his ability, and also his truthfulness. Wendell Phillips in his letter says, for example, again, we have known you long and can put the most entire confidence in your truth, candor, and sincerity. Everyone who has heard you speak has felt, and I am confident everyone who reads your book will feel persuaded that you give them a fair specimen of the whole truth. No one-sided portrait, no wholesale complaints, but strict justice done. Oops. Sorry. So the same happens at the beginning pages of Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl. There too does she try to establish her truth. And as I mentioned before, she's got that subtitle written by herself. There's also a preface by the author, Harriet Jacobs, and there's an introduction by her editor, who's named Lydia Maria Child. And Lydia Maria Child was a white abolitionist and writer of fiction. And then there's a letter from Amy Post, who was a women's rights advocate and abolitionist. She was part of the American Friends kind of revolution around questions about rights. And also a letter from George Lowther, who was an abolitionist. He was a well-known entrepreneur in Massachusetts, and he was a legislator. It actually excuse me, it actually turns out that George Lowther was from the same town in North Carolina, enslaved in the same town in North Carolina as Harriet Jacobs was. So in the letter from Amy Post, she said, the author of this book is my highly esteemed friend. If its readers knew her as I know her, they could not fail to be deeply interested in her story. She was a beloved intimate of our family nearly the whole year of 1849. She was introduced to us by her affectionate brother, who had previously related to us some of the almost incredible events in his sister's life. I immediately became much interested in Linda, for her appearance was prepossessing and her deportment indicated remarkable delicacy of feeling and purity of thought. And Lydia Maria Child says, the author of the following autobiography is personally known to me, and her conversation and manners inspire me with confidence. During the last 17 years, she has lived the greater part of the time with a distinguished family in New York and has so deported herself as to be highly esteemed by them. This fact is sufficient without further credentials of her character. I believe those who know her will not be disposed to doubt her veracity, though some incidents in her story are more romantic than fiction. She notes that the author writes so well and explains that the work she did as editor was simply light editing. In her own preface to the narrative, which I think is actually really great to teach, it's just a few pages, but you could talk about some of these issues, and it actually brings out a lot of really interesting issues around what it means to write this kind of story, to put your life on the table in this way. And also, she goes into a little bit of what it meant for her to write the book. But in this preface, she says, this narrative is no fiction. She writes, reader, be assured this narrative is no fiction. I'm aware that some of my adventures may seem incredible, but they are nevertheless strictly true. I have not exaggerated the wrongs inflicted by slavery. On the contrary, my descriptions fall far short of the facts. I have concealed the names of places and given persons fictitious names. I had no motive for secrecy on my own account, but I deemed it kind and considerate towards others to pursue this course. And that's Harriet Jacobs writing in her own preface. So now that we've established that Harriet Jacobs took pains to explain that her narrative was no fiction, and that she had written it herself, I want to talk about how gender played a role in people forgetting. And I'm going to put quotations among forgetting, but people forgetting who Harriet Jacobs was. So although Jacobs and her family were well known in activist circles in the 19th century, she was largely forgotten by the 20th century. And I'm putting forgotten into quotes because as a scholar and in the scholarly conversation, it's well known that Harriet Jacobs was forgotten. And in fact, scholars in the 20th century deemed her narrative fiction. They thought it was a fiction book written by Lydia Maria Child, who was pretending to write a slave narrative. That's what they had decided. And I kind of wonder what it means to forget in this context. Was she forgotten by everybody? Who were the people who remembered her? But the fact remains that scholars of 19th century literature had forgotten completely about who she was and her history. I have here on the screen a photograph of a school for refugees during the Civil War. So these are formerly enslaved people who had ran away during the Civil War, and congregated in Alexandria, Virginia. And in this particular refugee camp, Harriet Jacobs was running a school for children, supported in large part by her anti-slavery and abolitionist friends. And so it's just a really strong reminder that the archive shows us that Harriet Jacobs was doing a lot of work and had a lot of connections among abolitionists who certainly didn't forget her. So now I want to talk a little bit about why Harriet Jacobs was forgotten. So, one of the reasons people think Harriet Jacobs was forgotten was because her slave narrative departs from other slave narratives. It's very different. It's one of the few that was written, at least, and published before emancipation. It was published in 1861. And so it was like right as the Civil War was beginning. So it was a little bit later in comparison to some of the male narratives. And there are other slave narratives written by women that were published later. But it's a really different look and take at slavery. And so people who were writing about slave narratives in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were kind of comparing it with the other narratives and feeling like there was something about this one that didn't fit. Much of the scholarship in the 1960s and 70s focused on these heroic male slaves who were able to like throw off the shackles of slavery and take freedom for themselves. And a lot of their narratives kind of talk about this journey from being enslaved, then recognizing that slavery was wrong and that they should be free, coming to this sort of enlightenment moment, and then snatching freedom for themselves. Meanwhile, Jacob's narrative doesn't fit that pattern. Jacobs writes instead a lot about motherhood, and one of the major themes within her text is her experience with sexual harassment. Of course, scholars in the 20th century, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, had different kinds of expectations of who could be a writer, and in particular, who could be a 19th century writer. There wasn't much known about Black women's writing in the 19th century, and there was a lot of doubt that Black women could be writing for themselves and sort of articulating their own vision of what womanhood meant, especially what Black womanhood meant. And so it was just seemed more likely that this white woman wrote this book rather than Harriet Jacobs herself. I think another big reason why Harriet Jacobs was forgotten is because a lot of people don't think about or sort of lost interest in some of the really well-known Black women of the 19th century. So a question I usually like to ask if we were in person, I would maybe ask you all to raise your hands about, what year did Harriet Tubman pass away? Right? I would say, does anybody know what year Harriet Tubman passed away? Harriet Tubman passed away in 1913. So well into the 20th century. And we often think about Harriet Tubman as somebody who only existed in this period of enslavement, but her life and her activism was decades longer. In fact, in 1908, she was working on starting a home for elderly African Americans that had nowhere to go, many of whom were formerly enslaved people. Right? So she was doing activism in the 20th century. And Harriet Jacobs was the same. She was doing a lot of activism until her older years. But like Sojourner Truth, like Harriet Tubman, they all really struggled financially and were marginalized in a lot of ways at the end of their life. And so I think it's easier to forget about these women sort of as the decades move forward, not just because of a sort of purposeful forgetting after they're dead, but also a kind of marginalization at the end of their lives that was happening to them. Another reason that scholars have given for why people didn't think this story could be true is that when Jacobs wrote her story, she had a huge pride in her family history. She had family members who were free. Her grandmother owned her own home and ran a business in this town in North Carolina. And people thought, she knew who her parents were. And people thought that's just not a slave story, right? This is not the story we've heard about enslaved people. And so they found it somewhat unbelievable. Other people have written, the scholars at the time kind of wrote about how her self-possession, her notion of self seemed so strong. And how could it be that this person who had been enslaved hadn't been totally debased, right? What does it mean to have an enslaved person who has this sense of self that seems like it can't be shaken so easily? And this kind of leads to the next point. There are some writers who even disbelieve Harriet Jacobs in saying that Harriet Jacobs, she was sexually harassed by the owner and she refused his advances. And she talks about this in the book. There are a lot of people who disbelieved her, that her resistance to white domination and her resistance to her enslaver could have actually been successful. Like somehow she just made this up and that, of course, her life would have been worse than what she's actually saying. Harriet Jacobs writes in her text, she said, "My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each." And so I think it's just like, that's so powerful of a statement. And the question is, do we believe her that there is might in each? But you can hear her notion of self-possession in that quotation. All right, so I've kind of established that scholars decided that this book was fiction. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it came to be known that it was in fact true. Jean Fagan Yellen was a historian who recently passed away. She was originally from East Lansing, Michigan, so there's a little bit of a Michigan connection there. And she's a really important historian of anti-slavery activism. In 1981, she published an article called Written by Herself, stating that Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was actually an autobiography written by Harriet Jacobs. She based this on a number of letters she found between the white abolitionist Amy Post and Harriet Jacobs. And she found these letters as she was doing research on a book about interracial activism in the women's anti-slavery movement. So she found these letters and she realized that, oh, this book that everybody said was fiction is actually not. And that's really started her on this whole path to verify Harriet Jacobs' story. Throughout the 1980s, she uncovered hundreds and hundreds of more primary source material to verify the story. In 1987, she published an edition of Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, in which she added detailed footnotes that showed the real names of everybody who appears in the book, the real name of the town that Harriet Jacobs lived in, everything, right? She uncovers all this and then adds those details and footnotes. So as a reader, you can go through and find out who are the actual people behind the pseudonyms. In 2003, she published a biography of Harriet Jacobs called Harriet Jacobs, A Life. And in 2008, she edited the Jacobs Family Papers, which is a 2-volume set of primary source documents that she found that relate to Harriet Jacobs' life. And I have my copy here. Please don't if you get it from University of Michigan Library, you'll be stealing my copy. but it's a 2-set copy, and it's just published versions of all the primary source material. So it's really awesome. And I like to say that at the end of the day, Harriet Jacobs' autobiography is really one of the most verified pieces of autobiographical writing that probably exists in American literature, right? That the entire story has been verified in a way that's incredible. And this is just a quotation from Harriet Jacobs in a letter to Amy Post that she wrote in 1852. Amy Post was really behind trying to convince Harriet Jacobs to write her life story or to tell it to somebody. And Harriet Jacobs said in her letter, "Your proposal to me has been thought over and over again, but not without some most painful remembrance. Dear Amy, if it was the life of a heroine with no degradation associated with it, far better to have been one of the starving poor of Ireland, whose bones had to bleach on the highways, than to have been a slave with the curse of slavery stamped upon yourself and your children. I've tried for the last 2 years to conquer my stubborn pride, and I feel that God has helped me, or I never would consent to give my past life to anyone, for I would not do it without giving the whole truth. If it could help save another from my fate, it would be selfish and unchristian in me to keep it back." And in part of her research, Professor Yellen also found these letters between the editor, Lydia Maria Child, and Harriet Jacobs as well. And one of the letters that she found was a letter that Lydia Maria Child sent to Harriet Jacobs in 1860, just as the book was about to be published. And she said to Harriet Jacobs, "I have signed and sealed the contract with the publisher in my name and told them to take out the copyright in my name. I want you to sign the following paper and send it back to me. It will make the publisher safe about the contract in my name, and in case of my death, will prove that the book is your property, not mine." So you can see here in the archives this kind of careful attention to trying to make sure that we don't forget Harriet Jacobs, despite the fact that she actually was forgotten. But it was this work of Professor Yellen who helped us sort of uncover these documents and show us once again that Harriet Jacobs was indeed the author. And the story was written with the pseudonym Linda Brent. Part of it was because of the subject matter, which was somewhat sensitive. And the other part is because Harriet Jacobs was an escaped slave, and there was things like the Fugitive Slave Act and other things happening as she was writing that made her worried for her own safety and, most importantly, the safety of her children. So the cool thing, this is just a quick slide. I won't really explain it too much right now, but the cool thing about the work that Jean Yellen did is that, and this is from her edited version of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, I think. Um, I hope. It might be from one of these other books. But the cool thing about the work that she did is it allows us now to really see the whole world that Harriet Jacobs was creating in the text. So things like her Harriet Jacobs' grandmother, this is the town that Harriet Jacobs was enslaved in. And you can see her grandmother's house. And I mentioned before that her grandmother owned her own home. You can see where that was on the map. You can map that to where the father of her children lived, who was a white man who actually became a US senator. You can see where her enslaver lived and where she was enslaved at. You can see how close all these things are and kind of map it onto the story that she's telling. And so it's becomes really great in terms of thinking about how to see what she's talking about. So I'll just read a quotation from Jean Fagan Yellen that is um, it's from the essay that she wrote called Written by Herself. And it's sort of her conclusion about why it's so important to realize that this autobiography is true. She says, here's a Black American woman defying barriers of caste and class, defying rules of sexual propriety. She was joined by a white American woman to make her history known in an attempt to effect social change. It is ironic that this narrative, which was painfully written in an effort to give the whole truth, has been branded false. Now that the discovery of Harriet Jacobs' letters has established that her book was indeed written by herself, we can re-examine its place within women's writings, African American literature, and the body of our national letters. Okay, part 3, authorship and confidence. So now I want to spend most of the rest of my time just talking a little bit about what it meant for Harriet Jacobs to write this text and how she came to feel confident enough to do it. The first important thing to know about Harriet Jacobs, I think, was that she was a reader. She talks about in her narrative how she came to learn to read as an enslaved girl. Um, but it's clear that she was a reader throughout her life. And I know that from her autobiography that she was reading a lot of the Bible as an enslaved girl. But she was a reader and had opportunity to really immerse herself among books. She was influenced by a lot of African American and abolitionist literary influences. She worked with her brother, who was also a fugitive slave, in the anti-slavery reading room, an abolitionist-based reading room located above the North Star office in Rochester, New York. The North Star was a newspaper written and published by Frederick Douglass. And so she was sort of immersed in this literary world of African American abolitionist writing as well as white abolitionist writing. And she had a lot of opportunity to talk about those works with other people and to also talk with the writers of those works. It's also important to know that Jacobs was a reluctant writer. She didn't want to be the one to write her story at first, I think because she lacked some confidence in herself as a writer and probably lacked the time to complete her story. Her first idea was to have Harriet Beecher Stowe tell her story for her. And she asked Amy Post and the woman that she worked for as a nanny, um, she asked the two of them to sort of make an introduction for her to Harriet Beecher Stowe so that she could tell her story and have her write about it. But she had a bad experience with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was really interested in Harriet Jacobs' story. She wanted to use it, but she didn't want to write a story that was just about Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Beecher Stowe at the time was pretty obsessed with her book, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had already published Uncle Tom's Cabin, but she had been accused of making slavery seem worse than it really is. And so she wanted to write the second book that was supposed to prove that Uncle Tom's Cabin was true, or maybe, didn't exaggerate the harshness of slavery. And so she was starting to collect all these true stories of slavery to put in this key. And I haven't actually read The Key, but a lot of scholars say it's pretty sprawling and difficult text and doesn't quite make sense. But I can't say that for myself because I haven't read it. But you can see even in the subtitle, it says facts and documents. And so she wanted to put Harriet Jacobs' story. I think other thing that scholars have mentioned is that Harriet Beecher Stowe compiled this after she had written Uncle Tom's Cabin. So these were not necessarily facts that she knew ahead of time. Anyway, so she really wanted to add Harriet Jacobs' story to that. And Harriet Jacobs had asked Harriet Beecher Stowe that Harriet Beecher Stowe was about to go on a trip to England to do a lecture circuit. And Harriet Jacobs had asked her to take her daughter, Louisa Jacobs, with her. And she had said, this will be a great opportunity for Louisa, and it will be a great opportunity for you because you can have a formerly enslaved person go with you to your lectures and talk about what slavery was like. And Harriet Beecher Stowe responded that she did not want to take Louisa Jacobs with her because Louisa Jacobs was part white. And I guess you maybe um, both Harriet Jacobs was, of course, multiracial, but both of her parents were Black. And Louisa Jacobs' father was white. So she was very, very light. I'll say it like that. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's response was like, no, I can't take Louisa with me. If she comes with me to England, she'll be too popular. She'll get petted by the British people who love mulatta slaves like her. And it's my experience that mulatta slaves don't take this well, that it gets to their head and they become promiscuous, essentially. Harriet Jacobs was incensed. She was incredibly upset and basically had her representatives write back and say, don't mention me in any of your writings ever. Basically, get my name out of your mouth. And she was really upset that it was even an idea that her daughter could be promiscuous in any kind of way, especially based on her looks. At one point, Amy Post tried to convince Harriet Jacobs to go on a circuit in England, and Harriet Jacobs wrote back. And this is even a little bit later than when this incident happened, but you can just still hear her anger, but also a little bit of her humor and sarcasm. She said, think, dear Amy, that a visit to Stafford House would spoil me, as Miss Stowe thinks petting is more than my race can bear. Well, what a pity. We poor Blacks can't have the firmness and stability of character that you white people have. I hope that I shall not have to recognize the mote in my sister's eye, while she wants to guard against the beam in my darker brother. God bless you, Harriet Jacobs. So even she was still mad. She was still like, nah, I'm not going to. So after that experience, Harriet Jacobs decided to try to take on telling this story for herself. As she was trying to work on this narrative and tell the story, another piece of the puzzle to why she became a writer, and I think such an excellent writer, is that she was working for the Willis family. Nathaniel Parker Willis was a well-known editor and writer, part of kind of the great men of American literature, and he was friends with all the most important writers, white male writers of the 19th century. His sister was also actually a writer. And he created this writer's retreat in Cornwall, New York, which is where Harriet Jacobs lived and worked. And his idea is that his house in Cornwall would become a place where they would have great discussions of literature. All the best writers in America would come, and it would be the house in which great American literature was written. So I always like to joke with my students about how it turns out the maid, the nanny, wrote the best book that ever came out of his house. Harriet Jacobs ended up becoming really good friends with his wives. His first wife passed away. He got married. And his first wife was an abolitionist, was a friend of a new Harriet Beecher Stowe, and some of the other women abolitionists that Harriet Jacobs was connected to. And his second wife actually ended up becoming very close with Harriet Jacobs as well, and eventually purchased her so that she could not be afraid of getting caught up in the Fugitive Slave Act. But Nathaniel Parker Willis was not supportive. And this is a quotation from a letter that Harriet Jacobs wrote, which just said, "Mr. W. is too pro-slavery. He would tell me that it is very wrong that I was trying to do harm, or perhaps he was sorry if I would try to undertake writing my story while I was in his family." And so, in fact, he never knew that she was writing this book. He never knew that the great American literature that was being written in his home was being written by the nanny. Part of what made writing this autobiography difficult for her was that she was working full time. And so the only time she had to write was in her off hours, often at night. Um, in a letter to Amy Post, she mentions how difficult that this is. And she said, "My friends, Mr. and Mrs. Brockett, is very anxious that I should go to their home and write. They live very quietly and retired. They were here and spent a day and night with me and saw from my daily duties that it was hard for me to find much time to write. As yet, I have not written a single page by daylight. Mrs. W," well, this is his second wife, who had yet to learn that she was writing this book. "Mrs. W don't know from my lips that I am writing for a book and has never seen a line of what I have written. I told her in the autumn that I would give her Louisa's services through the winter if she would allow me my winter evenings to myself. But with the care of the little baby and the big babies and the household calls, I have but a little time to think or to write, but I have tried in my poor way to do my best, and this is not much." One of her other friends wrote to Amy Post and talked a little bit about a time where Harriet Jacobs got really sick and she had to get some time off from work. And he wrote, "She is becoming improved in health by thus freeing herself a while from the wild associations." So you can kind of see how, on the one hand, her work in this house, I think, was really like crucial because she was always in the middle of these literary conversations. And there were these really important literary salons going on at the time. And though she didn't participate in them, she was likely a silent observer often of the conversations that were happening. And when we think about her as a reader, we can also think about her as part of this literary conversation. We can imagine the kind of library that she had access to, right? On the other hand, we can also imagine how difficult it would be to be working full time, particularly in the background in this way, and still try to write a autobiography that is very serious and theoretical at the same time that she has these intense duties and also health problems. So one of the things that we know from the primary source material, and that I think is so great to share with students, is that she had a lot of writerly anxiety. And I know my students, and probably your students, have a lot of anxiety about being writers themselves. And so I'd like to share this story with them, just to know that even the best and smartest writers can go through these feelings. But when you have something really important to say and a voice, that leaning into that, even if you're not a confident writer, can be really powerful. And so in 1854, Harriet Jacobs wrote to Amy Post and she said, "Just now the poor book is in its chrysalis state, and though I can never make it a butterfly, I am satisfied to have it creep meekly among some of the humbler bugs." I really like this image because she knows what great literature is. And she's like, you know what? I'm going to do my best. It might not be great literature, but I hope that in its own humble way, it can do the job. She also talks about this anxiety. It comes up a little bit in the preface, "An Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl." And it's something that you can point to if you have your students read the preface. In the preface, she writes, "I wish I were more competent to the task. I have undertaken, but I trust my readers will excuse deficiencies in consideration of circumstances. I was born and reared in slavery, and I remained in a slave state 27 years. Since I have been at the North, it has been necessary for me to work diligently for my own support and the education of my children. This has left me much this has not left me much leisure to make up for the loss of my early opportunities to improve myself, and it has compelled me to write these pages at irregular intervals whenever I could snatch an hour from household duties. And I'll just note that in the primary source material of all her writing to her friends and to other people, one of the things we learn actually about Harriet Jacobs is that she was brilliant. She was a great writer. She had these like humor and really deep thoughts, but she did not know spelling well. Um, she didn't understand or write with proper capitalization or punctuation. And these are the things that Lydia Maria Child also mentions, that basically the only thing she changed with her editing was like putting in punctuation and capitalization and talking with Jacobs about order and stuff like that. Excuse me. And so that's an example of how, though she wasn't formally educated, she still was trying to think about ways that she could share this story. Right. So, in conclusion, what makes incidents in the life of a slave girl special, in my opinion? There's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I love teaching incidents of the life of a slave girl and talking about the narrative itself is because she merges genres so well. Anybody who likes 19th century women's fiction, like Jane Austen, will like Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. It sort of follows this women's fiction structure in a way that pulls you into the story. And so it merges these genres of slave narrative and women's fiction. Women's fiction at the time often used narrative engagement. Harriet Beecher Stowe did, the British authors George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell did. And this is where the narrator engages the reader kind of in dialogue. And you can see this in Harriet Jacobs. A lot of times she says, reader, she'll talk to the reader directly. It's also incredibly multi-layered. She was a very religious, moral person who was very interested in proper conduct. At the same time, there's this underlying humor and sarcasm as social commentary, and then she threads this needle really well and in an interesting way. And so I find that the text is so interesting in this way. I'll read a quotation that comes from the end of the narrative, which is shows a little bit how this is in relationship to women's fiction, but not really, right? A lot of women's fiction ends with marriage. So it's kind of like a marriage plot. And you have some of these elements in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, but it's not really what the book is about at all. And she says, reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage. I and my children are now free. We are as free from the power of slaveholders as are the white people of the North. And though that, according to my ideas, is not saying a great deal, it is a vast improvement in my condition. This one, scholar Frances Smith Foster says that Harriet Jacobs' declaration that she and her children are now free from the slaveholders' power as much as Northern whites are is really actually important moment in the text, and it does something that a lot of other slave narratives don't do. It's to suggest that there is not stability in the American notion of freedom. It is to suggest that while slavery exists, while the Fugitive Slave Act exists, Northern whites aren't free either. It's to suggest that Northern white women don't have complete freedom over their lives and selves. There's all this subtext there that leads readers to question, what does freedom mean? And does it go beyond just questions of slavery, right? What are some of the bigger ways that we can engage in a conversation about what American freedom should mean? And so she's writing not just about slavery in the South, but also racism in the North, intra-racial prejudice, and sexism in both the North and the South. So that is all I have for you today. I want to just note 3 versions of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. There's the version edited by Professor Yellen that I mentioned before, a version edited by LaKisha Mitchell that is great for students. It has some broader based primary source material. But actually the version I use is free on Documenting the American South, a UNC website. And it's just the original version. It has no footnotes, but it's great for students because they don't have to pay for it. And I would love to talk more about the text and any questions you have about it in our next webinars.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. This knowledge, this information is so powerful and so helpful to educators as they plan to incorporate comprehensive history within their classroom. So we sincerely appreciate you creating it and look forward to the remainder of your series. We also thank our attendees for listening and learning with our team. And I think you just heard Dr. Simmons' invitation to add questions into the chat, and she'll try to incorporate those during the remainder of the series. Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so they may share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all. Please plan to join us for future Teaching Comprehensive History webinars, including the next 2 presentations in these Women's Anti-Slavery Activism series, which will take place on the next 2 Wednesdays, May 8 and May 15. We encourage all educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website to review past webinars, gain access to incredible resources, and to register for future webinars.